I'm joined by journalist, historian, and Pulitzer Prize winning author Kai Bird. His books have included numerous forays into the mid 20th century and the people and events enmeshed in World War II. And he's told the stories of CIA officer Robert Ames, President Jimmy Carter, and even controversy around the Smithsonian's 1994 planned exhibit commemorating the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, among other topics. His work provides essential historical context for the figures whose lives he illuminates. And I'm speaking with him now because one of those lives has returned to the international spotlight 56 years after it ended. The new Universal Pictures movie Oppenheimer, written and directed by Christopher Nolan, catapults science, the ethics of scientific discovery, and the place nuclear weapons hold in our world to the forefront of the public conversation. And since Kai Bird has authored, I should say, co authored the book American Prometheus, which is considered pretty much the definitive biography on Robert Oppenheimer, I figured it would be a really special treat for our listeners to hear from Kai himself. So, thank you so much for making the time. And I wanted to just kind of jump right into some questions that came up for me on reading the book. And of course, contemplating Oppenheimer's place in history. So you co-authored this definitive biography with Martin Sherwin. He passed away in 2021, so we obviously can't hear from him. But I was wondering, what was the genesis of this book?
Well, thank you for having me, Jess. This is fun to talk about the book. But to answer your question, well, Marty Sherwin started this biography in 1980. He
Wow.
signed the contract and he worked on it for 20 years. He was a tenured professor at Tufts University in Boston. And he just did an amazing amount of research, um, over 150 interviews, and went to archives in this country and abroad, and accumulated 50,000 pages of archival documents.
Ooh.
And but he never started to write. He sort of got biographer's disease, which is when you're the biographer and you're just certain that there's one more archive and one more interview that you need to do before you can begin to write.
Right.
So Marty and I had become friends in the course of the 80s and 90s. And finally, in 1999, he came to me and suggested that I should join him on his project. I had just finished a biography of McGeorge Bundy, and it had been published in 98. And I was sort of at loose ends. I wasn't quite sure what to do next. Um, and Marty, he had a great sense of humor. He said, "Well, if you don't join me on this project, my gravestone is going to read, 'He took it with him.'"
That's great.
And anyway, I after some doubts, I actually did join Marty in 2000, and we went back to Knopf and renegotiated the contract, and got a little more money in advance so that I could have something to live on.
Hmm.
And then, I started to write off of his material, and then he started to write, and it turned into a fabulous collaboration. But it still took us 4.5, almost 5 years for the book to come out. It came out in 2005, and yes, it won the Pulitzer the following year in 2006. And in a miracle of miracles, here we are in 2023, and Christopher Nolan has picked up the film option and written a screenplay and turned it into IMAX feature, and it's going to be released on July 21st.
It's pretty amazing to see what goes on to actually reach this point. I mean, that is decades, literal decades of work. So I think there are a lot of people who are eagerly anticipating this. And for people who are listening who haven't read the book, it's 700 plus pages. So this is an incredibly well researched narration of Oppenheimer's entire life. I mean, little kid years all the way through to the end. So
Yes,
I
it's
know
a
it.
full biography, very in depth, and but it has a lot about the science, I should say, but it's got much more about the man. You know,
Exactly.
if you're a quantum physicist, you're not going to learn anything from this book, but you will learn a lot about Oppenheimer, the man, and he's a fascinating figure. He's a mystery. He's a very complicated personality and a scientist who loved French poetry and the novels of Ernest Hemingway, and he loved horseback riding in New Mexico, and uh, was so interested in the Hindu scriptures that he learned Sanskrit so that he could read the Gita in the original. Anyway, he's a wonderful figure and quite complicated, and it's
Right. And so this may be asking a lot, obviously, because you already wrote 700 pages on this exact thing, but would you be able to give us just a really broad sketch of why Oppenheimer occupies so much space in modern history? Just kind of put him in context.
yeah. Well, he as a young man in his 20s, he was on the cutting edge of quantum physics in the 1920s, and then he became a Berkeley physics professor after studying uh, theoretical physics in Germany. And then at the age of 38, he's selected by General Leslie Groves to become the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, and builds this secret city in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico called Los Alamos, and builds the gadget, the atomic bomb, in less than 2.5 years. So he's the father of the atomic bomb, the sort of iconic historical figure that signifies, the dawn of the atomic age. But then, he's a hero in 1945. His image is put on the cover of Time and Life. But then, just 9 years later, he's destroyed, humiliated in a kangaroo court where his loyalty to the United States is questioned, and he's eventually stripped of his security clearance. And then this is all the trial transcripts, as such, were leaked to the New York Times, and he's publicly humiliated. And he becomes, he goes from being America's most famous scientist and public intellectual on scientific issues to a nonentity, a pariah. And so this is what's really fascinating about his life story, that it's, the triumph of the invention of this atomic bomb that he was building precisely because he feared the Germans were winning the race to acquire this weapon of mass destruction in the midst of World War II. And then he becomes, then there's the tragedy of his downfall at at the height of the McCarthy era, and he becomes, the sort of chief celebrity victim of the McCarthy witch hunts.
I think that's excellent for context. I appreciate that. And I know that as a historian, you've probably spent a lot of time thinking about historical contexts and what that means for the people who live through these big monumental eras where we see these dramatic shifts. And I did read something that where Christopher Nolan asserted that Oppenheimer is the most important human to ever live. And what do you make of that? And how did you like the movie? I read somewhere that you've seen it, so I was just kind of wondering what your take on Christopher Nolan's take is.
Well, I think what Nolan means when he said that is that Oppenheimer signifies the dawn of the atomic age. And that's very significant because we are still grappling, trying to learn how to live with the atomic bomb. And, it's the story is not over and it could still end tragically with Armageddon. We could still, atomic weapons have not been used since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, but it's possible that they could be used again. And so Oppenheimer's life story is extremely relevant, particularly since he not only was he the father of the atomic bomb as such, directing the project that invents this weapon, but he immediately afterwards begins warning about the dangers to humanity posed by this weapon of mass destruction. And so that's the significant thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so you did you enjoy the adaptation of your work?
Well, I don't want to spoil it for viewers, for people who are going to go see the movie. I'll just say that I think it's a stunning cinematic experience, and it is indeed based on American Prometheus, this biography that Marty Sherwin and I wrote on Oppenheimer. And I think it's historically faithful to the book and accurate. It's an amazing film. And finally, I guess aside from the sort of stunning cinema of this 3 hour movie, it I'd say that people are going to maybe go into the theater thinking that they're going to see a film about atomic the atomic bomb, uh, and then they're going to go out realizing they've seen a biography, a deeply biographical portrait of a very mysterious man. It's a mystery story, like any good biography. It's a mystery story, and
That's
it's about the man, not the weapon. And I think it's just brilliant.
Oh, that's an excellent, I guess I should say, enticement to go and see the movie, and I'm gonna be there opening day for sure. So I wanted to then ask you, in your opinion, why haven't we seen any nuclear weapons used since the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Luck,
That's
mainly
an
just old-fashioned luck, because there have been some near misses. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a crisis in 1983 that is not very well known, um, and Oppenheimer himself warned in 1945, just 3 months after Hiroshima. He warned in a public speech in Philadelphia. He said that you might think that this weapon is very expensive because it cost $2 billion in 1945 to produce, but it's actually very cheap. And any society, however poor, anywhere in the world, any country that chooses to acquire these weapons can do so. There are no secrets. The physics is known. It's just an engineering problem. And that is known too, how to do it. And it's cheap. And so, he was predicting here we are with North Korea having an atomic bomb, and Iran is getting one, and India has one, and Pakistan has one. And indeed, it is something that, proliferation is a serious problem. And we may, in the decades to come, find that more countries in the Middle East, for instance, will acquire these weapons, or more countries in Europe or Asia. And every time another country acquires a weapon of mass destruction, the possibility of their use increases. So it's it's a serious problem hanging over our heads.
And I think that summing it up with one word is just brilliant because, we try to sort of look into a crystal ball when it comes to foreign politics, when we're interacting with other nations and the policies that legislatures create. And I think that sometimes it's simple. It's there's a very simple answer to it, and that makes it all the more urgent for us to
Yeah,
address.
we've been very lucky, and I should mention that Marty Sherwin's last book that he published actually just before he died, at the age of 84, is called "Gambling with Armageddon," and it's a book about the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also a sort of a history of the military thinking behind and strategizing behind the acquisition of nuclear weapons from 1945 forward. And in the book, he makes it just amazingly clear that in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came just very close to an exchange of tactical nuclear weapons. We didn't even realize that the Russians had placed tactical weapons on their submarines that were patrolling off the waters of Cuba. And one of these submarines came under attack by U.S. military ships, and that were trying to surface it. And the captain on the submarine gave the order to use one of these tactical nuclear warheads on a torpedo. And it didn't happen only because by chance, just complete luck, there happened to be aboard that submarine someone who could outrank him, who was a high ranking apparatchik from the Communist Party. And he countermanded the order and averted a nuclear war. And it's a very gripping story. And Marty tells it with um, amazing detail. He was a terrific historian, and I'm very sad that he's no longer here to see all the hoopla around the release of the Christopher Nolan film.
Yeah, it's always kind of it's a good thing but a sad thing when a really excellent writer passes away because you've got their words, but then you know that there won't be anything new they add. So, but no, I really enjoyed the whole book and that American Prometheus, and I think I wanted to ask for you on, as your personal understanding of science and government, World War II, and nuclear weapons, how did all that change for you from working on this book in particular?
Historians peel back the archives sort of very slowly, and it's a process of discovery. It's a treasure hunt, and so you learn things along the way. Um, I don't know my learning. I'd written about the Cold War before tackling Oppenheimer with Marty. I'd written about the Cold War in my biography of John McCloy and in my biography of McGeorge Bundy. Um, but this book sort of was American Prometheus was different in that it was much more personal. It was really focused on Oppenheimer the man. And well, let me tell you, when I joined Marty on the project, he at one point he had been working on the book by that time for 20 years, and he one day turned to me and he says, we you and I wouldn't be spending so much time on this subject. We wouldn't even be writing this book if it was just a story about the father of the atomic bomb, if it was just a story about the Manhattan Project and the the triumph of building that weapon in the midst of World War II. No, what made it compelling to Marty and me is that is the downfall that happened after the triumph. The fact that there was an arc to this story, that Oppenheimer himself, was a very extremely enigmatic young man and had great ambivalence about what he was doing. Uh, and and then 9 years after his triumph, he is humiliated in this McCarthyite kangaroo court, and that's what is just astonishing. It's an amazing story um, that this happened in America in 1954, but it suggests, looking back on it from our vantage point today in the Trump era, I would argue that the story is extremely relevant. It explains Donald Trump. The seeds of Donald Trump were planted during the McCarthy era, and we're now sort of reaping the uh, the consequences of that all these many years later.
I'm gonna get to that, which is great, that you're already have laid that foundation here. So in my learning about Oppenheimer, it seemed to me that if he's guilty of anything, it's being a scientist. In other words, he was updating his understanding of the world around him, in particular, like Russia and U.S. relations post World War II, when he got new information. It seems like his views evolved, his positions evolved as he understood situations on greater levels with more depth. So would you call that an accurate assessment? And what prompted him to create, unfortunately, unwittingly, so many enemies who were really resistant to the idea that a scientist's views could evolve over time?
Right. Yeah. He Oppenheimer had a tendency in his personality. He could be uh, very patient and sweet with his students and with strangers that he encountered on the street. Um, he was an extremely polite and dignified man, and yet he could, when confronted with people in authority or people who presumed to uh, be on his level or presumed to know physics when they didn't, he could be extremely rude and cutting and arrogant. And he made quite a few enemies in powerful places. And most particularly, he alienated Louis Strauss, who was a self made millionaire businessman who got himself appointed an admiral during World War II. And he sort of Strauss presumed that he knew a lot about the Manhattan Project. He'd had some peripheral involvement in it during the war. And he got Dwight Eisenhower to nominate him as chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission in 1953. And at the same time, Strauss had become chairman of the board of trustees at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he recruited Oppenheimer to become director of the institute in 1947, and thought that was a coup to be able to recruit the father of the atomic bomb to come to Princeton. But they were like oil and water. They just clashed. It was bad chemistry. Oppenheimer was of Jewish ancestry, but he'd been raised as a young boy in the Ethical Culture Society, and he didn't really consider himself to be, he certainly was not a practicing Jew. But Louis Strauss was. Strauss was the member of a conservative temple in New York, and he took his Jewishness very seriously, and he didn't understand why Oppenheimer didn't. And Oppenheimer went out of his way to sort of be rude to Strauss and mocked him in a public Senate hearing one day in 1948 or 49. And then there were policy disagreements. So Oppenheimer was always skeptical and a critic of the US relying on nuclear weaponry as a defense. And he came out in 1949 after the Russians exploded their own atomic bomb, and there was a sort of wave of hysteria in America about how to respond. Oppenheimer opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, and thought, was arguing publicly, increasingly so publicly in 52, 53, that this was unnecessary. It was a waste of money. It was creating the hydrogen bomb was creating a weapon that could only be used on huge cities, and not, that it wasn't a military weapon. And Strauss considered this to be evidence. Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb, Strauss considered this to be evidence of perhaps disloyalty or subversion, and he dug into his FBI file. He had access to that kind of classified information, and as the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and he knew all about from the FBI file. He knew all about Oppenheimer's left-wing activities in the 1930s, and so he jumped to the conclusion that Oppenheimer was a danger to the national security state, a danger to the development of the hydrogen bomb, and maybe he was a spy. And so Strauss actually orchestrated the 1954 security hearing that brought Oppenheimer down. And he did so in a very nefarious sort of conspiracy.
Ugh. And I think it is one of the things that I've seen in my days as a scientist that has lingered for so long is this understanding that scientists who speak out about various political issues can suffer consequences. And so this kind of is a nice segue into talking about the growing distrust of expertise and scientists in general that we've seen in the US over the last decade or so, but very much so during the previous presidential administration. It seems like this has happening quite a bit in the US, but also to a lesser degree around the world. This sort of expertise is not wanted or needed, and scientists aren't seen as the same kind of trustworthy figures that they were several decades ago. So, from your perspective, what are the lessons that we should be amplifying from Oppenheimer's both his scientific innovations and from the tragedy of the end of his professional career as a government scientist?
Yeah, well, I think what happened to Oppenheimer in 1954 sent a message to scientists everywhere in the US, but around the world, that if you are a scientist, you have to be very careful and beware of getting on the public stage and presenting yourself as a public intellectual with expertise, because people can come after you, and it sent a message that scientists, need not be trusted. And Lord, you can look back at what's happened during the recent pandemic, where public health officials were their views were questioned, and their authenticity and honesty were brought into doubt. And I think, the fact that this can be done so easily, that so many Americans can be distrustful of scientists and of expertise. This is deeply rooted in our culture, and it. I think you can trace it back to what happened to Oppenheimer in 1954. Um, he at the time was widely respected and given a platform to talk about public issues. And today, I don't think you can go look around the country and see, that there are very few scientists of that caliber who have a public standing. Scientists have sort of trained themselves to speak only about their very narrow lane, their their expertise in a very narrow scientific sense. And yet we need these people who understand the world, a world in which we're drenched with technology and science. And these are precisely the people that can help us to figure out how to manage this world, how to live with not only the atomic bomb, but now artificial intelligence. And they're exactly the kind of people that we should be listening to and encouraging them to participate in civil discourse. But instead, we leave that debate to uh, elected politicians who often don't have any expertise at all. So it's a conundrum.
Yeah, and I mentioned to you before we started recording, just for the listeners here, that I had run for U.S. Congress in 2018 as a scientist, which garnered a lot of news coverage because it was seen as so unusual. And so I think it's unusual because Oppenheimer's the attack on him professionally, had such a chilling effect on political activism by scientists. So is it your view that scientists should be more engaged in politics and the public conversation today, in spite of what happened to Robert Oppenheimer?
Yes, absolutely. I think scientists should be encouraged to run for public office and to write op-ed pieces and help to explain to the general public the sort of scientific method, the process, the fact that we're all scientists are experimenting, that public health officials are constantly trying to look at the evidence, and of course they change their minds at times because there's new evidence, and there is no one truth, but there is a constant effort to understand the science and the physical world around us, and that takes um, the scientific method of testing and experimenting and being open to new evidence. And this seems to be a, a process that most Americans don't understand, and that makes it difficult for us to have a political conversation that's based on reality.
I want to say here, here to that. And so, one more Oppenheimer specific question before we start to wrap things up here. So, over the course of all of your research and writing of this book, if there was one piece of information that you had about Oppenheimer, whether it was a recording of one of his lectures or a video of him or photos of him or reading other people's thoughts on him, if you could direct listeners to one thing that isn't your book to get a real sense of the man himself, what would you point them towards?
Uh, you mean an anecdote in my book?
Yeah,
Uh,
anything like that that really shows people who he was to the best of the ability that any one thing can kind of encapsulate that.
Well, I mentioned that he was a very complicated man, and ambivalent and shy, and yet capable of getting on stage and giving a performance. So here's a story I like to tell that sort of sheds some light on Oppenheimer, the man. Um, I discovered sort of late in our research and writing that uh, Anne Wilson Marks, who was Oppenheimer's last secretary at Los Alamos, was still alive. This is in like 2003, and she was living in Georgetown, not far from uh, where I lived in Washington D.C. And so I looked her up and interviewed her in her house, and she told me the following story. She said that one day she was walking to work with Oppenheimer, and this was in July of 1945, just after the Trinity test had successfully demonstrated the first atomic bomb. And they're walking together, and suddenly Oppenheimer is shaking his head and muttering to himself, "Those poor little people, those poor little people." And Anne stopped him and said, "Robert, what are you talking about? What are you saying?" And he looked at her sadly and said, "Well, the Trinity test shows that this gadget now works, and we know it's going to be used on a whole city in Japan. And most of the victims of this weapon will be women and children and old men, civilians. That's a whole city because the weapon needed to be tested on a large enough target to show its strength, its destructive power." And so he's thinking, tragically of what's about to happen to these poor little people. And so I conveyed this story to Marty after I did the interview, and he managed to look up and realize that in the chronology, this conversation that Anne and Robert had in July of 1945 must have been during the same week that Oppenheimer had actually briefed some of the bombardiers who were going to be on the airplane to drop the atomic bomb. And so he was instructing them actually exactly how to detonate the gadget at exactly the right altitude so that it would have the most maximum destructive power on all those poor little people. So this is an astonishing man who can, you know, contain in his head these two thoughts. He can, be in the same week. He can be doing his duty, carrying out his responsibilities as a scientist, conveying how to deploy this weapon, and at the same time, he can be worrying about the tragic human consequences of what he's doing. So he's very conflicted. And this, I think, this is admirable because it shows, it gives him his humanity. Um, so he's an incredible figure.
It sounds like he's not the kind of person that you write about and then forget. It seems like it was a pretty monumental undertaking to make the book happen, and you obviously have carried the deep knowledge of him throughout your career since the publication of the book. And congratulations on it being made into a film. I think it's really important for, especially for people who weren't alive during those war years, who didn't understand what the country was going through, what the world was going through.
Right.
So I just appreciate that there are historians and journalists and authors out there like you and like Martin Sherwin who have done the hard work of putting this all together for us. So I do want to close out because we are the Union of Concerned Scientists, and we are very concerned, as one would be in this day and age. So I'd like to ask all of our guests, why are you concerned?
Yes. Well, it's an issue that we should all be concerned about, and it's. I hope that this film and the book, of course, will prompt people to have a new conversation about the importance of atomic weaponry and uh, how we should be figuring out how to survive in the atomic era and how to regulate these weapons of mass destruction, and also to reflect on the, uh, the major and troubling issue of McCarthyism that has that plagued our country back in the 1950s and still does to this day.
Uh, I think that's a fair set of concerns there, and very valuable for us to look at in this day and age. So, thank you so much for making time for the conversation, and also for your work preserving vital parts of our shared human history. This is the kind of thing that should never be forgotten. So, I really appreciate you taking the time to do your work and to speak with me about it, Kai.
Thank you, Jess.